Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Uber to the Pits podcast. I'm your host, Chris Emery. Today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Ed Potkanowicz. We're going to talk heat stress, hydration, what can happen to your body if you're not prepared, the difference between hydrating for an endurance race compared to a sprint race, and everything else that can be involved with your body with the heat and hydration. We talk a little bit about a study he did with the Taylor brothers and Wayne Taylor Racing in 2016 and 2017 and 2018, and how much information they get out of athletes now that race, where they used to not really be able to. We'll touch a little bit on that. So in the meantime, I hope you guys enjoy. And don't forget our wonderful partner, Intrinsic Products. That's INTRINSIC products.com. for a great variety of dash cams and action cam at great prices. Also, when you use the code Uber to the Pits, you get 10% off at checkout. Again, it's Intrinsic Products, INTRINSIC products.com. Uber to the Pits at checkout, get 10% off. I know we didn't have an episode last week. It was Valentine's Day week. I hope everybody had a wonderful Valentine's, and we're ready for this week. So I hope you guys all enjoy Dr. Ed Potkanowicz and enjoy what he has to say. The stuff we do talk about will be up on Instagram, the charts and graphs that he talks a little bit about as well. We touch base on that too. So I really hope you guys enjoy. You know what? And on top of that, let's go green. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Uber to the Pits. I am joined by Dr. Ed Potkanowicz. We're going to talk about hydration, heat stress, the effects it has on your body, and what you really need to be aware of inside the car, especially when that ambient temperature gets so high. You may think that you're going to be racing during the winter, cooler temperatures, that it's not going to affect your body, but little to find out, you're going to be wrong about that. Ed, thank you for joining me.
Chris, you're welcome. I'm happy to chat, and I'm happy to share my work and the things I know with you and your audience. I think what you're doing is a really good service to the racing community, because I think this is information that they desperately need to know, because I think that you're right. I think that a lot of the racers aren't necessarily aware of all that can happen when they're subjected to the kind of heat stress that they experience in the car. So happy to be here, happy to share what I can, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, let's get started. I always like to ask all my guests, what was it that got you started into motorsports or piqued your interest into auto racing along those lines?
Well, that's a sort of a multi-factorial answer. First and foremost, I've been a fan of racing since I was a wee little lad. I can remember sitting in front of the television as a kid watching Wide World of Sports and watching the various kinds of motorsports, drag racing with Big Daddy Don Garlis, and watching the Grand Prix from Monaco. And all of those things just caught my eye. And in the early days, it was just, things were going fast, and that was really cool. And as you start to learn about racing, like everybody, you learn that there is so much more to it than just the speed. There's the car, there's the driver, there's the setup, there's so much to follow. There are so many storylines to follow that it just sucks you in. So from a very early age, I've always been attracted to motorsports as my thing. And then the unfortunate part is that I grew up in part of the country where wasn't much in the way of karting, and so I didn't have an outlet for that. And so I just, watched motorsports and went to the occasional race when I could, or the occasional drag race when I could, and the things that were in my area. And as I went along in my education, that was what I did to sort of relax and kind of calm down after a day at school. When I started doing my graduate work, and we started investigating environmental responses of the human body, I started to realize that being somebody who had a history of following motorsports, as I got into my own education, undergraduate, graduate school, and my doctoral training, when I would be in the lab and when I would be in the library looking up literature about the work we were doing in the lab, I would occasionally wander over and start looking for things about driver athletes, and I wouldn't find anything. And so it piqued my curiosity that for all that we knew about the traditional athlete, football player, baseball player, track and field athlete, we didn't know anything about the driver athlete. In fact, people weren't considering or thinking of race car drivers as athletes. And so that's kind of where it all began. It's a history of really being a fan of motorsports, and I guess maybe being, wishing I could have been a driver, to finding my way in my academic work and my research work to work in the motorsports industry. And that's kind of how I got into it. It's always been there. And then I found a way to incorporate it into my professional work and into my scientific work.
So that's awesome. And I just want to step back a little bit when you talk about driver athlete. If you think about the driver athletes from the, 50s, 60s, 70s, even to the early 80s, even maybe to the end of the 80s. These are guys that you'd still see smoking cigarettes on the grid. As soon as they get done, they're opening up, popping beers. So a lot of people didn't really look at them as the athletes that, you had in the NBA, the NFL, hockey, track and field. Really, I think the driver's starting to get a little bit more recognition as a true athlete within the last 25, 30 years, especially, with what the stress loads and everything going on inside the car. I still find it funny when your typical big four, big five sport athlete says, oh, but how could you be an athlete? You have something with a motor pushing you around, or you have a motor between your legs with the motorcycles. And I almost just want to be like, I want to see your endurance level, your strength level doing this for 30, 45 minutes, heck, even 15 minutes in a go-kart.
Yeah. I think that you're right. I think that the idea that drivers are in fact athletes started to get some traction around the late 70s, certainly into the 80s, when you had drivers like Ayrton Senna, who actually had their own trainer, who were aware of their body and understood the stresses that their body was going to be subjected to, and then trained their body to those stresses. And even in the late 70s and in the early 80s, it was still maybe not that popular. But as the car developed and as it became more stressful for the driver to manage that car, the driver really had no choice but to abandon the cigarettes and to abandon the beer and start training themselves like a traditional athlete. I think the reason why people don't really consider drivers to be athletes is because, well, like you said, what are you doing in the car? But if you actually look at the driver in the car, if you examine that athlete the way that we've examined traditional athletes, you'll find that they're doing a lot. The difference is that where I could probably go measure an NBA athlete while they're playing basketball, or while I might be able to measure a football player while they're playing football, I can't actually measure a race car driver while he or she is in the car, just because of the nature of motorsports. And because we couldn't measure it, because we couldn't put a number to it, we couldn't say, well, you guys are athletes. We don't have their 440 time. We don't have, we don't have the number of free throws they can make. We don't have, what you have is the report of the driver. And so what's happened in the last number of years is scientists like myself and like others are actually starting to measure the driver athlete during competition.
Let's bring that up,
and
because
to find out that they're exactly the kind of athlete that the traditional athlete is.
Because a couple years ago, you were able to work with Wayne Taylor Racing, work with Jordan and Ricky Taylor on actually getting some measurements. I think also with the external measurement ports that cyclists use or triathlon athletes use to measure heart rate and stuff like that. Technology is actually helping us be able to measure what goes on the car with these athletes. Are you able to talk a little bit about what the research was with the tailors and what you've been able to find out?
Oh, absolutely. Um, it's to the point that I was making just a moment ago. You can measure what an NBA athlete is doing. You can measure what a Major League Baseball athlete is doing. It's very hard to measure what a driver athlete is doing. And with the advent of microtechnology and newer technology, we can actually now measure the driver athlete while they're in the car in competition. And so what we were doing with Wayne Taylor Racing was I was using technology that's now probably, oh gosh, maybe 20 or 30 or 40 odd years old, but it's an ingestible pill, and the pill has got a radio transmitter in it. And what that radio transmitter does is it sends out a signal that is picked up by a receiver, and that signal is the driver's core body temperature. When you combine that with a heart rate monitor that they wear, you can get some really decent data about what's happening to the driver physiologically while they're actually in competition. And so what we did with Wayne Taylor Racing was we outfitted Ricky and we outfitted Jordan during the Petit Le Mans of 2016. And it was really interesting to find out that when Ricky got out of the car after his first stint, his core body temperature was 102.8 degrees. Now, to put that in perspective, if you have a temperature of 102.8 degrees, you're probably going to go to urgent care and you're probably going to be put into a fever protocol. They're going to want to get your body temperature down because a body temperature that high isn't good for a protracted period of time. But we found that Ricky got out of the car after his first stint with a core body temperature of almost 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Likewise, Jordan got out of the car after one of his stints, and his body temperature was 101.6, so almost 102 degrees. The question then becomes, how do you train these guys to tolerate this kind of temperature? How do you recover in between stints, especially in endurance racing where the driver is going to be in the car for 2 or 3 or 4 stints in the course of the event? The same thing that we would ask about the traditional athlete. How do I prepare them? How do I help them to recover? How do I help them to perform better? The intention of the work we were doing with Wayne Taylor Racing was to take that data and to use it to help them do exactly that. How do we help you recover? How do we help you prepare? And how do we make you more competitive? And more importantly, how do we make you safer?
And I like how you use the word safer because there's an additional part of this is hydration and overheating your body and what actual toll your body takes with the overheating and what it could cause, mentally with the physiological breakdown, with the physical breakdown. You become a danger to yourself. You become dangerous to the others on the track. And so that mentality of just staying hydrated and being able to train for these types of situations.
Oh, absolutely. The issue of hydration, the issue of feeding, all become very important, especially in endurance racing, but also in other forms of racing. We were fortunate enough to continue to work with Wayne Taylor Racing, and we did all. And we were able to track a number of different variables that relate to hydration, that relate to feeding. And you're absolutely right. Hydration is desperately important because when you become dehydrated, there are a number of physiological systems that are negatively impacted. Cardiovascular, muscular, cognition, your ability to make decisions, your ability to multitask. All of these things are compromised the more dehydrated you become and the more physiologically stressed you become. And then we're talking about making a lap time. All of that becomes compromised if you're not physically up to the task of it. So it becomes the issue of proper hydration before you get into the car, proper hydration while driving if you're in a series where you can hydrate while you're driving, proper hydration once you get out of the car in between stints. And that's where it becomes sort of a real specialty, because how you treat the endurance driver from a feeding hydration perspective is going to be a little bit different than how you might treat, say, an IndyCar driver who, once they get in, they're really not going to get out, and they have a limited amount of fluid that they're going to carry with them in the car. So preparation becomes a really big key issue for the IndyCar driver, and then preparation and recovery becomes a really big issue for the endurance car driver. So hydration is desperately important, because something so simple can have so many different impacts on a driver's performance.
Yeah. Along those lines too, it's like I've had it where guys have, just having a general conversation. Oh, I don't want to drink before my race because I don't want to have to stop and use the bathroom if I have to go, or this race is going to be too long. Why, I'll just drink a little bit now and drink, little bits here, a little bit there, a little bit there, instead of, stacking up and then being able to keep your body hydrated and then just using that little interval of water throughout the event to keep yourself satisfied.
Sure. I understand what you're getting at, and I understand the point that the drivers make when they say, well, I don't want to overhydrate because I don't want to have to go to the bathroom when I'm in the car. I mean, we've all heard the jokes about, a driver turning over the car to another driver and the seat's wet. No one wants to do that. But if your strategy is well planned, if your hydration strategy is well thought out, then you're not going to get into the car having overhydrated. You're going to get into the car being well hydrated and properly hydrated and ready to perform. Secondly, it's not just about water, because when we sweat, not only do we lose water, but we lose electrolytes. We lose sodium, we lose potassium, we lose chloride, we lose a variety of electrolytes, all of which are important to physical performance. So it's not just about drinking water, it's about measuring how much you've lost, replacing what you've lost, but also replenishing and replacing the electrolytes that you've lost, so that when you get back in the car for your next stint, you're as near to normal as you were when you started your first stint. So all of the things that you're mentioning are valid concerns on the side of the driver, but they can all be addressed with a good hydration strategy, both prior to the race and during the race.
So for somebody that races, let's say we'll use an endurance race, maybe not, Sebring Petite or Daytona, because those are the long ones, but, like Long Beach, it's a 2 hour, 10-minute race. Detroit's like another 2.5 hour race. So you have two drivers that you're splitting the stints with. What would you recommend would be a proper based build up strategy for somebody doing a 2 hour or 3 hour enduro?
The best way to do this, and I know this is going to sound strange to some of your listeners, but the best way to do this, frankly, is to check your urine color. It's the best indicator of hydration status, hands down. It's not high tech, it's not very scientific, but it tells you a lot. And you don't have to know much to look down and evaluate the color of your urine. In fact, go right ahead.
I was going to say, I still have your urine chart from the safety seminar that where I first met you. I will post a picture of that up online for people to see.
I think that's a fantastic idea, because the fact of the matter is your body tells you what your body needs. And something as simple as looking down when you're using the restroom and gauging the color of your urine is going to give you a very good indicator of how much you need to drink in order to go into the car well hydrated. The goal, in the simple sense, is to get into the car with a urine color that is relatively clear. That's your body telling you you're hydrated, you're well hydrated, you're ready to go. And for all intents and purposes, if you go into the car well hydrated, you're probably going to come out the other side a little dehydrated, but not as much as you would have had you gone in already dehydrated. And that's the problem that a lot of drivers kind of come up against. They don't want to have to use the bathroom. They're concerned about water consumption, so they stop drinking and they go into the car to some degree already dehydrated. And then you put the stress of driving on top of that, and they're going to come out of the car even that much more dehydrated.
And then that's where you got to plug into the IVs, do the reload. Exactly. And
listen, there are all kinds of different ways that you can do it very scientifically. There are all kinds of ways that you can do it. Listen, the simplest thing to do if you want to know how your hydration status is, when you're in the bathroom, look down and use the handy dandy chart to find out where you are and hydrate accordingly until you get back to being clear.
Now, here's a question about that. I know a lot of drivers use supplements, multivitamins, stuff like that. That you can be well hydrated, drinking, the amounts of water you need, but the supplements can throw you off with the color.
Yeah, and about supplements, and I'm going to take just a little side journey for a second here. I'm not the biggest fan of supplements because, as the name suggests, a supplement is supposed to be a supplement to a well balanced, well thought out feeding strategy. If your feeding strategy is solid, if it's well thought out in the context of what you need to perform, then you shouldn't need a supplement. The only time that a supplement is necessary, really, is when you're training to such a level that you just can't get all the calories that you need. And then you would use a supplement. The same thing with electrolyte supplementation. You can really, when you don't know what you're doing, and I'm not trying to suggest that people don't know what they're doing, but if you don't do it well or if you don't do it right, you can really mess up your electrolyte strategy. And you can actually put yourself in a condition that you would do yourself more harm than good with the electrolytes, which is why my recommendations are always start with the basic, well-balanced diet, well-hydrated state going into a race. When you come out the other side, there should be a feeding strategy and there should be an equally well thought out rehydration strategy. If you do it good on the front end, if you do it good on the back end, then there really shouldn't be a need for supplementation. There really shouldn't be a need for putting anything in the water. But that's where technology is also helping us as well. There's now technology out there that allows us to evaluate what the driver's lost in the way of electrolytes. And knowing that, we can then give him a recovery drink that has the proper proportion of sodium, the proper proportion of calcium, the proper proportion of chloride, and get him rehydrated in a good and well thought out way, and we don't need supplements. So you're absolutely right. Supplements can be good in some instances, but in other instances, they can change the response of the body and kind of throw off your decision making.
Gotcha. And like I was saying, that could also change the color of your urine, so be aware of that too. If you do know you're on supplements and
most supplements, when used as they're intended, really shouldn't change the color of your urine that much. Some supplements may darken the urine, but what that's telling you is that the body's trying to get rid of that excess, and that really, to balance that out, you should be following those supplements with proper hydration. If you look at what a lot of the supplements recommend, they recommend using them, but also using them with water, because you don't want to throw off that very delicate balance.
Exactly. Now, kind of transitioning back to the tailors, were you able to find any information about the hydration loss versus with the like with what they took and the monitors and stuff like that, sweat loss, all that?
We were, and we used that information to help them in the recovery, just like I was mentioning before. So when we were working with the team at the 24 Hours of Daytona, we would measure their body weight going into the car. We would look at their baseline electrolyte levels. We would then release them. They would go drive their stint. They would come out. We would evaluate their weight loss, how much weight had they lost or how much water had they lost in the course of the stint. And then we would look at the change in electrolyte concentrations. And then we would rehydrate them equal to what they had lost, both fluid, that we could return them back to, let's say, a normal state prior to their next stint. So our goal was always to get them as close to normal as we could before we set them off for their next stint. So we were using that data in real time to make decisions about how to rehydrate them and, in some instances, how to feed them.
Gotcha. Now I know this is always a thing that comes up, is the water loss and weight loss. Jordan and Ricky, they're not very big boys at all. They're fit, they're lean. What was their average weight loss per stint?
That depends on the event. So Petite that year was particularly warm. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, at the start of the race, it was near 80 degrees, 78, almost 80 degrees. At the end of Ricky's first stint, he was down probably about 4-ish pounds. So
Wow.
Ricky weighs in, oh gosh, if I'm remembering correctly, about 127, 125. He came out about a heavy 4 pounds light after his first stint. And because they are so similar, we saw similar changes in Jordan as well. Now, compare that to, say, Daytona, where we were working with Jordan and we were working with Ranger. And in that year, 2018, we were working with Ryan Hunter-Reay, who was the third driver for the team. Um, that was a somewhat cooler race, or at least it started out cooler. And so we didn't see as big of a weight loss from water loss with those three drivers as we did in an event was a little bit warmer.
Yeah.
So you can't say necessarily that there's an average, because it very much depends on the environmental conditions. But regardless of whether it's hot, whether it's cold, these guys are working very hard, and there's going to be a fluid loss. So it's not uncommon, to your point, it's not uncommon for them to lose a fair amount of weight. Now, the recommendation is this. The American College of Sports Medicine says you shouldn't lose more than 2% of your body weight. This is, in many instances, well above 2%. So whether
easily.
it's 4 pounds or 6 pounds, it's still a fair amount of body weight loss, and you have to work to replenish that.
And you just mentioned something talking about weather, cold weather. I know a lot of guys will get this mentality of cold weather, like, oh, I'm going to be, my body's not going to be as hot, this or that. But the ambient temperature inside the car still gets 100 plus degrees. You got to, factor engine heat, low ventilation.
You're absolutely right. The environmental conditions, while they play a factor in the equation, if you will, they sometimes play a bigger role and sometimes they play a lesser role. Regardless of that, what drivers have to remember is that, first and most importantly, the byproduct of muscular contraction is heat. So as you're driving and as you're using your muscles to maintain a posture in the car, as you're using your muscles to drive the car, as you're using your muscles to work the pedal, the byproduct of that muscular contraction is heat. So you're producing heat. Add to that you have a heat-producing engine behind you. And then add to that at least in a closed cockpit car, you don't have much airflow through the cockpit. So all of that heat is being maintained in the closed cockpit. And then on top of that, you put the fireproof underwear that the driver is wearing. You put the multi-layer fire suit that they're wearing. You have a very challenging environment for the driver from a thermoregulatory perspective. So even though it might be 75 degrees outside, you're still going to sweat, and your body temperature is still going to go up, and it's still going to be challenging. Is it going to be as challenging when it's 75 degrees outside as when it's 95 degrees outside? No, but it's still going to be challenging. And athletes have to remember that regardless of whether it's 75 degrees or 95 degrees, you still have to have some kind of hydration strategy. You still have to have some kind of feeding strategy to manage that weight loss, that water loss that you're going to experience, regardless of whether it's only 75 degrees outside or 95 degrees outside. You're still doing work. You still have to replenish that stuff that you've lost.
And I don't want people to think, oh, just because I'm in an open cockpit car, I get all this wind on me, it's going to help keep my body temperature down. It may help a little bit, but again, you have a super hot engine, very low airflow in that cockpit, and you try to be as aerodynamic as possible in those open cockpits, you're still going to have this heat stress issue. In fact, there's a few famous pictures of Formula One. Who was the Formula One driver that showed passed out on the side of his car after a race?
Oh, Mansell.
Mansell, there you go. From heat exhaustion.
Mm-hmm. Red 5, yeah. Yeah, and similarly, you have a very famous picture of Nelson Piquet collapsing on the podium. There are a number of examples. Jimmy Johnson in NASCAR, Nelson Piquet in Formula One, Nigel Mansell in Formula One. Anecdotally, if you listen to drivers, they will tell you when they come out of the car, how gutted they are. Dario Franchitti mentioned after qualifying at Mid-Ohio a couple of years back that every one of the drivers was just utterly gutted because of the environment and because of the work they were doing. So it's no secret that these guys are working their tails off to drive these cars. I just don't know that people understand how hard they're working.
Exactly. I think about like when I'm in the car, not only, really the only time I get to relax is going down the front straightaway or the back straightaway if nobody's around me.
Oh, absolutely.
Other than that, I got to worry about who's in front of me, who's on the side of me, who's behind me. Am I hitting my brake point? Kind of like when I was talking to Dr. Jacques Dallaire about focus and where to focus.
Sure.
There's all this stuff going on in the cockpit that you have to be cognitive, and you're going to make these mistakes if you're not properly hydrated, not properly focused, not properly trained with your physical and mental areas.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, I would also argue that going down the straight, while it might be easier than managing the corner, hitting your braking point, hitting your apex, you're still going to be busy. The driver is still going to be busy when they're going down the straight. They're going to be looking at their data stream. They're going to be listening to the car. They're going to be checking the car. They're going to be communicating with their engineer. So while it may just be them on the straight by themselves, there's still a lot of work to do, whether it's physical work or cognitive work. There's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of focus that must be maintained, and that all takes energy. And if you're not well hydrated, if you're not well fed, if you're not well trained, the fact of the matter is you're not going to do as well, and you're not going to last as long before you fade out and, God forbid, start making mistakes.
No, absolutely. And we know those mistakes could be small mistakes. They could be big mistakes. They could be deadly mistakes.
Absolutely.
And that's one
Absolutely.
thing, we want to try to help prevent and help people understand the variety of importance of what little aspect takes, whether it's water, controlling your heat stress, proper fitness, proper, healthy eating, diet, focus, mental work. These are all things that all come into play at once to keep you safe and other people safe on the track.
Oh, absolutely. And that people don't understand all of that spectators and perhaps even other athletes, that they don't understand and appreciate that is, I think, a great disservice to the driver athlete. And going back to an earlier point that you and I made, I think the tide is turning. I do think people are starting to recognize that drivers are in fact athletes, and they're very well-trained athletes. If you look at athletes like Carl Edwards, if you look at athletes like Jimmy Johnson, if you look at guys like Tony Kanaan, these guys are training 365 every day of the week, and they're involved in ultra marathons, and they're doing Ironmans.
Yeah, look at Jensen Button.
They're athletes because they know the value of being prepared.
Jensen Button during the summer break would come out and go do the Ironman triathlon. Oh, I'm not racing this weekend. I'm going to go run hell and do the Ironman.
And all of that training serves them when they get into the car. Because, like we said earlier, the cars are developing by leaps and bounds. And the driver is the person responsible for controlling all of that. If they're not prepared, they're not going to perform. And that's the simple fact of the matter.
No, absolutely. And you're not going to perform. You're not going to be on the track much longer. You'll be watching from the stands.
Exactly. And there's not a driver on the planet that wants to lose his ride.
No. Or not have one and just be like, hoping and wishing.
Yeah, exactly.
Ed, thank you so much for your time today. We've got a plethora of facts and information that's going to be useful for these drivers. Is there a way that if people have questions, social media, anything like that, where they could come find you? Or
Oh yeah, I'll tell you what I'll do. Maybe if you want to, you can put it online. I'll give you contact information. I'll give you my Twitter handle. I'll give you a link to my webpage where people can find some of the work that we've done. I'll make sure that you have my email so people can reach out to me by email. I'm happy to chat with anybody about concerns they might have. The work that I do in my lab is really about helping drivers to improve and helping drivers to be safer. Um, and if I can answer a question for somebody, I'm happy to do that. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll make sure you have all of my relevant contact information. And if you want to, feel free to put it up there on your website. And the listeners can reach out to me if they want to.
Sounds good. Thank you all for joining us on the Uber to Pitch journey today. I'm your host, Chris Emery. Go follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Uber to the Pits. Also find us at ubertothepits.com. If you have any questions or would like any updates, you could join the list on the website there, or you could shoot us an email at info at ubertothepits.com. Hope you guys have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.